guys so much for dealing with this. I've got rather janky hardware that we're dealing with today, so it's like a Volvo. It's battered and dependable, but it needs a little work. So thank you very much. We will be talking about the important impact that art has had on science. I'm real close to you guys, so we'll work on it. And I'd also like to acknowledge that a lot of my lecture has been drawn from Human Anatomy, which is a visual representation from Renaissance to the Digital Age by Benjamin A. Rifkin, Michael A. Ackerman, and Judith Goldberg. I always like to cite my sources. So when we think about anatomy, it's pretty easy to visualize our internal organs, our heart, lungs, liver. These are things that are taught to us from a very early age, but it hasn't always been that way. The insides of our bodies have actually been a mystery for most of human civilization. For a lot of human history, dissection has been considered messy, sacrilegious, illegal. It's been reviled by human societies for quite a long time. In fact, to cut into the body was seen as an affront against the gods themselves. If this is our divine form, then to peer into the mysteries of our insides would be to kind of challenge the gods. Not only that, but if you believed in bodily resurrection in the kind of Abrahamic tradition, then you were just going to be a hot mess in the afterlife. Like organs splayed everywhere, you weren't going to look good, so why would you want that? But without internal medicine, we wouldn't have any hope for survival. As I was saying, this was discouraged in Western, Ayurvedic, and East Asian medicinal practices for some time. However, we do have some exceptions. One of them being Herophilus. He was an incredible physician. He was a Greek physician who operated in Alexandria during the 4th century BCE, and he was the first to extensively dissect and record scientific information on cadaver research. Now, he wasn't the first to dissect humans, because actually part of ancient Egyptian funeral rites was to cut open the body, take out your organs, put it in some jars for the afterlife. But he was the first to record these incredible findings that filled 9 volumes of books. Just some of his medical discoveries. He differentiated between veins and arteries, decided that the brain was the center of intellect and not the heart or the liver, according to the Mesopotamians. He described most parts of the eye. He used the pulse in diagnostics with the use of a water clock. He actually had to help invent a way to track time in order to help with the pulse. He mapped out both reproductive systems accurately, which seems to be something that we're even beyond us today. He's made incredible observations on the paralysis from nerve damage, as well as naming the meninges and the ventricles in the brain. And this is just to mention a few. Now, unfortunately, there was a little bit of a fire in Alexandria back in the day, and so we lost a lot of that information, but luckily for us, Gallant just copied it all anyway. Now, Gallant was a towering figure in Western philosophy and Western medicine. He contributed greatly to anatomy, neurology, physiology, most of the ologies that you can think of, but he supplemented this knowledge by working on cadavers that he found that were criminals. So he could kind of work a little bit on criminals through his contacts. He worked on injured gladiators from those crazy awesome fights. And he also worked with mammals. So he operated on primates and on pigs. And from these observations, he was able to do a pretty good job of mapping out the human body. However, as brilliant of a scientist as he was, he made some major mistakes. He said that the heart had 3 ventricles, not 4. He said that we've got 5 lobes on our livers, not true. And this prevailed in our understanding up until the 16th century. So for 1,300 years, this was the common thought. Galenic thought was the towering, end-all, be-all. To challenge him was basically to say, oh, Einstein's an idiot. You don't do that. So why was this the case, though? Why was Gallant such an important figure in information and education for so long? Well, part of that had to do with the way that information was disseminated. It took a long time for technology to evolve. So we went from writing on wax tablets with styluses to papyrus to vellum and finally to paper. And books were incredibly expensive to produce. Everything was handwritten, and the only people that had access to books were usually the wealthy or the elite, or sometimes you got them in monasteries. But most of the time, the books were the Bible, or maybe you only got the hours. So it wasn't until the printing press was invented in the 15th century that finally we had a better way of facilitating the spread of information. And along with this invention, there was suddenly a new market that cropped up that needed information. There was a desire for more fantastic compendiums. These are these incredible books that you would have like a botanist drawing of a flower next to a unicorn. Because again, this was the 15th century, so our understanding of our environment was just beginning to move out of the religious understanding of it and more into a secular understanding. And so with this evolution of our understanding of our knowledge came this greater desire, this greater need, this demand for information. Also in the 15th century, Pope Sixtus IV, he issued a papal bull allowing executed criminals to be dissected, which was fantastic news for physicians. Now suddenly we had access to cadaver research. We weren't just kind of guessing, which was a lot of what was going on. And so part of this was actually to create a fate worse than death. So again, as we said, if you believed in bodily resurrection, getting dissected was the worst thing ever. Along with this, so medical schools rejoiced because suddenly anatomy labs were being added to the medical curriculum. But like we discovered with the advent of books, this created a great demand. And that demand was for cadavers. Now, unfortunately, there we go. Bodies are kind of a finite resource. They decompose pretty rapidly. They get gross real quick. And it's difficult to procure. There's only so many criminals that are executed in a certain amount of time, hopefully. And so with this limited amount of cadavers for working on, you also had them resorting to rather unscrupulous tactics. So there were anatomy schools that paid men to dig up bodies from the earth, or kill their family members, or work in hair, which had a great side business going on until they were discovered. And you also had a very limited amount of time to work on these cadavers. So only from October to May could you actually do any dissections, because again, bodies just got gross. You did not want to be in the operating room in the summer. That was the last place you wanted to be. So what do? When you have this need for information, when you have a vacuum that needs to be filled, and when you have schools that are resorting to shady practices in order to fill this, what do? And that's where Andreas Vesalius came in. He was a brilliant anatomy professor who worked in Padua. And what he did was he challenged Gallant, which was a major, major thing at the time. Again, it was like saying Albert Einstein was like a total idiot. Part of that was because so many physicians and so many lecturers did not do their own dissections, which seems crazy to us now. But dissections were actually performed by barber surgeons. Barber surgeons were a completely different class from what we consider today. We would put surgeons and physicians on this great lofty perch that go to millions of years of school. But back then, barber surgeons were tradesmen. They pulled your teeth, they lanced your boils, cut your hair, whatever you needed to do with your physical form, that was their realm, whereas physicians and educators and lecturers, they dealt more in theory. So what the moon phase was at that time was why you had diabetes. That's kind of what they were working with. And so what he did was he did his own dissections, and he said, hey, why are we perpetuating this misinformation? The heart clearly does not have 3 ventricles. The liver clearly does not have 5 lobes. Why are we perpetuating this information? Why is challenging this figure so wrong? And so what he did was he brought an artist into the anatomy lab with him. And he made the most detailed, accurate drawings he possibly could. He made sure to map out every part of the skeleton, the skin, the lymph system, every single part. They did a beautiful illustration so that he could publish a compendium that people could access at any point in time during the year. You didn't have to wait for October to May. You didn't have to go to this particular school. You weren't confined to being a rich student at a Padua University. This was major. And so when you look at the woodcuts from this book, the fabric of the human body, it's so lovely. You can point out on that picture the tibia, the femur, the ribs. You can point out every single bone in the human body. And that was never done before. And also, one of the things that I love about this is that it wasn't meant just for medical students. This was meant for the layman. So these pictures show a rather human stance. He shows them toiling in the fields like a common folk. This was meant for people who wanted to learn, who were curious, and not just doing this as an assignment or as a way into a job. Another amazing book that came out was by Jacque Jacquet de Gatti. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the title of the book. It's very French and I would ruin it. But he created the first anatomy book with 4-color process. Now, he says that he invented the 4-color process. What he actually did was he just improved upon his predecessor's 3-color process, added 1 color, and then said he invented it. Just pretty interesting. But so, and what's interesting about this book is that it wasn't necessarily anatomically correct. So this wasn't something that as a medical student, as someone who is practicing in the field, could look at and be like, okay, that's where our limb system is. But it was still beautiful. It was meant to show the human body in a positive light. It was meant to show us as something more than just creatures of sin, more than just creatures of habit. This was meant to put the body into a divine light, into something beautiful, something to be celebrated. And the other thing that I love, it paved the way for more accurate illustrations in textbooks. By perfecting this colored process, you're able to better illustrate the maladies that we experience. Now with this, the advanced categorization of pathology, art allowed us to catalog the results. So as we got better and better and better about our sciences, art allowed us to capture that, to look back and to reference it. So we have rare case studies that are able to bolster the field of teratology and congenital deformity. Now you have instances where, okay, this is not just, you looked at that guy wrong and so now you've got a bad baby. It's no. There is a process to this. There is a path, there's an organization, there is a reason why we experience these things. And now rural doctors, the doctor working out in the farm, in the fields, he now has a way to reference the difference between inflammation caused by arthritis or inflammation caused by infection. He's able to treat his patients better, able to give them a better life because now he has a way to reference what's happening in their bodies. And another indispensable guide for categorizing and cataloging were wax models. And these rose to prominence in the 14th century Italy, ironically enough from a form of saint worship, of creating little idols for saint worship, but then medical schools caught on to these incredible wax sculptures and were like, hey, I think we can make use of this. And so sometimes what they were wax sculptures made out of layers and layers of wax and dye, or they were actual preparations of the specimens themselves. So there were specimens that were injected with wax compounds and able to preserve them. And this gave them, this wasn't just a picture, this wasn't just an illustration, this was a 3D model that they could look at, could grasp, could hold to get a better understanding of the insides of ourselves in order to better practice and heal. Now, can anyone guess what this image is? It's a stomach. Beautifully played out like a lady's fan. It shows you just how incredible our bodies can be when we take a look outside of ourselves, outside of just this is a thing that digests, but what an incredible organ it is. I love these because I think they're so beautiful and they allow us to look at ourselves in kind of a different light. And that brings us to where we are today. Plastination was invented in 1977, and what it does is it's not just a wax sculpture, it's not just a preparation. It's actually taking the human body, using osmosis to replace all the fats and water with plastics, and creating a movable piece of art that is an actual person. And there are various exhibits that travel all over the world of different controversies. There's some that are rather legitimate and some that are like, nah, those are abandoned bodies from a different morgue that you just took out and decided to plastinate. But the Gunther von Hagen's one is fantastic if you ever get a chance to see the bodies world. This is where he takes real bodies presented in their organic and lovely glory, and back muscles splayed out like wings. Our skin flayed off to reveal the machinations that make us tick every single day, these delicate inner workings that help us to get up and move and live and breathe. And it's so lovely. And it's extraordinary to go from cutting open pigs in order to piece together what our anatomy is, to viewing body dissections as high art. And the advancement of medicine is based on practices both compassionate and cruel. But it is through the dissection of the human form that we are able to know what makes us whole once more. And none of this would be possible without the merging of creative artistry, physiological precision, and concise technology. And I think it is especially important to remember today, at the time where STEM fields and computer technology have taken center stage in our educational institutions, to remember the importance of the arts and humanities. Because it is in the collaboration between art and science that we find our greatest achievements. Thank you.